David, welcome to Renegade Inc. and also welcome to Kokonomics, the Norwegian meeting place.
Thank you.
Head, hand, heart, the search for dignity and also status in the 21st century. Unpack that a little bit for us, insofar as why that title and why status and dignity.
Yeah, the title is kind of part of an explanation of what the book is about. It's part two, really, of my previous book, The Road to Somewhere, which was about value divides in rich industrial democracies, the value divides that have led to Brexit here, Trump in America, and so on. And this is sort of digging a bit deeper into the problem of educational stratification, cognitive stratification, if you like. And the basic argument is that we have allocated too much reward and prestige to one cluster of human aptitudes, those aptitudes associated with cognitive, analytical ability, exam passing type skills, and we've inevitably diminished some of the other clusters of aptitude, particularly those associated with hand and heart, meaning care, emotional intelligence, and so on. And that has become seriously dysfunctional, I think, both economically, but also culturally and politically. A couple of caveats. Obviously, head, hand, and heart is an artificial distinction. Everything we do, every human act is a combination of the cognitive, the emotional, and the embodied. But there are different kinds of jobs in modern societies that tend to focus more on one of those clusters. The other thing I would just do, the other caveat, is that high intelligence is obviously as vital as ever for the future of human society. And this is not an argument against high intelligence. We need very clever people collaborating in teams together on the internet to come up with a vaccine for COVID-19, apart from anything else.
Right, but you're making that demarcation between the three, head, hand and heart. What you're saying is, in the first chapter of the book, is we've had peak head. Insofar as actually we've given so much focus and so much onus to cognitive workers, knowledge workers arguably, that actually we've left the other two sectors behind. And the other two sectors function in the real economy. They add real value. Talk a little bit about that. What has been the societal effect of focusing so hard on bright young things going to university versus people who are way more vocational but create incredible value in the real economy?
Well, I think it becomes both economically dysfunctional, particularly, as we will no doubt discuss, with AI coming down the road. A lot of the functions that we've expanded higher education in many of these countries to fill are no longer going to be there. You're already seeing some signs of that. And it's also politically and culturally dysfunctional because people have a range of different attitudes. There are some people who are academically able, and they, particularly those with the highest academic ability should obviously always use that and go into the highest kind of academic functions and universities. But there are a lot of people who are of kind of average ability, and what we've done in most of, particularly in the US and the UK, is encourage people of kind of average ability to go down the cognitive path, rather than their parents or their grandparents' generation would have developed other kinds of aptitudes, which would both give them a better life. This is trying to push round pegs in square holes. It would have given them a better life, and the economy is now absolutely crying out too for these lost skills that have been lost because so many school leavers are going into academicized courses at university.
Are those problems that you highlight in the book, i.e. too much of cognitive class and too many head workers, not enough people who work with their hands and not enough people who work with their heart, are they peculiarly British problems, or is this happening as a sort of worldwide phenomena?
I think to some extent this is a trend that all rich democracies are suffering from. I think the problem is worse in the US and the UK than it is, say, in the Germanic countries, Scandinavian countries.
Why have the US and the UK gone so hard down this path, whereas other countries have actually pulled back a bit and maybe recognised the value of the real economy?
I think it's partly because of the cultural domination, cultural hegemony, if you like, of higher educational institutions like Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. God knows how many, almost all our prime ministers went to one or the other over the last 150 or 200 years. The Ivy League universities in the US, the Grande École in Paris. I mean, 3 countries that have, in different ways, placed a huge amount of prestige in the kind of higher intellectual, higher cognitive functions, and where the status lies, lots of people want to follow, and we've had less embedded systems of vocational education and training. We've had, the UK used to have a decent apprenticeship system. The US has always had rather a weak formal apprenticeship system. Those things tend to have much stronger roots in much of continental Europe, and a sort of sense of sort of separate but equal. Whereas here it perhaps gets tied up with the class system perhaps a bit too. That that high status and high reward has been overwhelmingly a kind of cognitive, analytical intelligence thing, and there's one or two exceptions. Obviously, rich footballers and entrepreneurs, and there are other forms of prestige and wealth. But for the kind of unexceptional, that seems that is the highway to safety and success. And if you're a parent, that is what you want your kids to do. 40% of jobs in the UK economy are graduate only. So you're bound to. There are all sorts of biases towards it that, and other countries have those too, but I think perhaps to a lesser extent than here.
You reference somebody in the book who conceals his job. He's a mechanic, earns very good money, and the reason he doesn't want to tell people that he does that job, specifically women, is that he thinks that they will, think negatively of that. The status of a mechanic. But hang on, earns really good money, can pin a family down, can provide all those things.
Yeah.
What's happened? Why have we got ourselves into this snobbery where we look down at mechanics and up to hedge fund managers? I mean, surely it's totally the wrong way around.
Well, finance can serve a useful function,
but it is a massive cost centre. And since 1986 in the UK, the Big Bang there's been all sorts of problems with finance growing to the size that it's grown.
No, I agree with that. But you can sort of see, because any job that is sort of connected to the great Ganges flow of money tends to be, pretty well in all societies, finance tends to be better paid than non-finance, and that's a particularly big problem in the US and the UK. Our economies are rather over-financialised. But as I say in the book, a bus driver, a highly skilled and responsible job. You're carrying 70 or 80 people through rush hour to their jobs in central London every morning. Why are you paid half as much as a junior account manager in a city PR firm? These are sort of big questions to do with the allocation of sort of social value. But these things can shift and do shift, sometimes quite quickly.
And post-pandemic world, is this a ripe sort of moment for us getting back to understanding what's fundamental and what's real, what creates real value, as opposed to the sort of ideals that we held before this?
I think it will do. I think it has done. I think in the respect that we now have for a lot of these, a lot of the so-called key jobs were jobs done by non-graduates, and I think it's also. I think it's been we've also fallen back on family. Many of us. I think this has been I think the pandemic has had both a kind of quite a small c conservative. So it's been the hour of the nation state. It's all been about national social contract. It's been about collectively ensuring people's incomes through states and welfare states. The international organisations haven't had a great pandemic. It's reinforced family life, I think. We hear a lot of the bad news stories about that. So there's obviously been increases in abuse and so on when families are thrown together in these circumstances. But I think, a lot of surveys that say, parents say that they get on, I think 2/3 of parents I saw in some recent survey said that they get on better with their children because they've been forced together to talk to each other.
But it's also shown the role of key workers, and they're not just the medical professionals, nurses, etc. It's people who do value-creating jobs in the real economy, whether that's stacking a shelf in a supermarket or whether it's getting food to a supermarket. It's also we've surely had to rethink how we regard those people.
No, absolutely. And I think that can only be a good thing, that it's already started to kind of equalise status a bit in our societies. And I think the other impulse from the pandemic will be a very social democratic one. I mean, that we will demand higher minimum wages. We will demand better conditions for a lot of the people that were barely visible to us before. And of course, we already spend a lot of rich countries already spend a lot of money on social welfare, but the only route is up. I mean, we're going to spend a lot more, partly because we're going to have to be prepared in the future for returns of the pandemic. So we're going to have to build in more buffers into our system. And indeed, so, the countries that have done best are those that, either by design or by accident almost, have had buffers in their system. So one of the reasons why Germany, in the European context, has probably done best of the big European countries is partly because its health system has a lot of spare capacity. And indeed, there are incentives on German hospitals to keep people in beds, because they get, every night somebody is in a bed, they get paid by the insurance company, however many euros it is. Whereas the incentives in many other countries was to get infected old people were being sent back to old people's homes, and that happened to a far smaller extent in Germany, just partly because of the extra resources that their health system
But
has.
it's also how we regard workers, isn't it, in the UK? I mean, you quote Camilla Cavendish in the book and say the term basic care dramatically understates the work of this group, helping an elderly person to eat and swallow, bathing someone with dignity, communicating with someone with early onset dementia. Doing these things with intelligent kindness requires skill. And if you look at, for instance, the Scandinavian education system, teachers are held in very high esteem, not so much here. And same with care workers like this. And what we've sort of done is in the US and the UK is we've praised, back to the bankers, we've praised the commercial sector, and we've left the hand and heart workers behind, saying, oh, well, they'll just get on with it. We don't need to give that too much focus.
I think that's true, but I think it's partly, particularly in the care area, there's been a sort of historic bias, a sort of patriarchal bias, if you like, of sort of thinking, oh, well, these are just aptitudes that sort of come naturally to women or certain kinds of women, and therefore they don't, therefore it doesn't have to be rewarded. And of course, don't forget, a lot of these functions, until quite recently, were done in the private domain of the family. I mean, and they're now, many of them, done in the public care economy, looking after old people or young people in creches and nurseries and so on. But I think there's a second factor, which is the ease of measurement of merit, as it were. I mean, it's much easier to distinguish in the cognitive field through exams and SATs tests and IQ tests. You can test whether someone is appropriate to a job or how able they are relative to somebody else. In care, it's much harder. It's a very elusive thing. It's very difficult to measure. And you get this even within nursing. I mean, the lowest status form of nursing in most hospitals tends to be geriatric care, right? Because other kinds of nursing care, you're part of some sort of acute team. It's kind of it's exciting. You're saving a life. And the outcome is visible and measurable. Either the person dies or they don't, and you are part of a team that achieved that. But if you're in geriatric care, you're just making some poor old lady's life a little bit less miserable for a few days. How do you capture that? How do you measure that and reward that?
But maybe this has been one of the problems, because not everything. Back to Frederick Taylor, the first management consultant. He said, if it can be measured, you measure it and then manage it, basically. And this was about people putting a nut on a wheel in a factory. maybe we've fallen into the trap of standardization of education in the cognitive class, and then what we're trying to do is take that and try and measure in the heart class and in the hand class, and actually those measurements aren't right. People in those classes and those vocations create value. We don't need a standardized testing process from the cognitive class.
No.
To then just try and...
But we do need something. We need a distinct form of testing. And this is one of the paradoxes that I'm writing about in a way, which is that, the cognitive meritocracy has kind of run away with itself and become too dominant in our society and economy and culture. But in some ways, we want, as it were, to transfer some of the kind of techniques that have been developed there and apply them in order to help raise the status of care in particular, but this perhaps applies to aspects of manual craft and higher manual technical functions as well. But it's a very difficult thing to do. As I said, it's very elusive. It's very difficult to measure and count in the care economy in a way that it isn't in the kind of cognitive economy. But
all this is well and good, and it's good theory, and we can talk about it, but we can't contextualize it, because really what we have to do is make a comparison. And you write that the gap between the richest and poorest regions in the UK is almost twice as large as France and 3 times larger than in Germany. I mean, there must be a link between the central thesis of your book and the fact that we've got such a massive gap in comparison to our European neighbours.
Yeah, I think these things are connected, and I think it's partly because it's the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial economy, really. Industrial economies sort of by definition tend to be spread out geographically, partly because the coal mines and the steel mills and the big ports and so on are geographically dispersed. So you used to get a geographical dispersion of particularly those highly valued, kind of middle pay, middle skill jobs. I mean, the sort of skilled manual type, the kind of the archetypal kind of lathe turner in an engineering factory. For all sorts of reasons to do with natural resources and so on, these jobs were dispersed. In a post-industrial economy where the main, as it were, sort of source is knowledge and cognitive ability, the main driving force, you tend to see agglomeration in big metropolitan centres, and you get all these beneficial agglomeration effects that economists talk about. So you get everybody, particularly the exam-passing classes, as it were, pouring into the metropolitan centres and perhaps the university towns too. And those other parts of the country, perhaps 2/3 of the country feeling left behind, and often actually denuded of its brightest people too. I mean, this is one of the contradictory things in public policy over the last 20 or 30 years. On the one hand, we've been talking about equality of opportunity and meritocracy and getting as many kids as possible into higher education, but that also then has the effect that working class towns in the Midlands and the North, in places like Mansfield and Rotherham, lose every year 20 or 30% of their brightest 18-year-olds to universities, or possibly local universities. They might go to Sheffield or Nottingham or whatever, but they're very unlikely. Most of them don't ever return to where they came from.
So a domestic brain drain.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a domestic brain drain, while at the same time politicians are wringing their hands about regional inequality. Whereas with one hand they're creating it, when the other hand they're saying, how can we stop it?
We've got to look at our own assumptions too, because speech in 2017 by the former politician Justine Greening, she's the former Secretary of State for Education, no less. She said, when she was growing up in Rotherham, I knew there was something better out there. And the point you're making is that those comments are just accepted. They sound exceptional. That's the way forward. That's sort of clambering up the greasy pole. But you're making a different point, aren't you?
Well, I don't want to sort of sound as if I'm saying everybody should sort of stay in their place. There is a kind of balance to be had in all of these arguments. And of course, lots of people will want to, from whatever social class background, people want to spread their wings and fly off. And, a lot of people find their families or their local communities that are oppressive and they want to leave. And that obviously should remain possible. But but we shouldn't exclusively reward, both sort of economically and culturally in a way, the levers, and that's what we do. And we partly reward them through the kind of agglomeration effects that I was just mentioning, which means that people tend to get, often doing pretty similar functions. If you're a kind of a lawyer or accountant, you're going to get paid more in Manchester or London than in Stockport, say. And also, I suppose, a more fundamental point that kind of, that sort of intelligence is its own reward. I mean, if you are a bright person, you're quick on the uptake, you find it easy to, learn foreign languages or whatever. I mean, that is a big, you've kind of won the lottery of life in itself. But then we kind of, it's the Matthew principle. We then kind of further reward it. And I do think that one of the things that might make this, that might help to shift the balance going forward is proper broadband communication everywhere. I mean, I remember talking to people who live in the countryside, that the sort of sense that you can actually run a business from a small village in Shropshire,
especially now.
Yeah, a lot of these things have been reinforced by the pandemic. So that might make it. But public policy should be more even-handed, as it were, between the levers and the remainers. I don't mean in a Brexit sense. Indeed, it's usually the opposite of levers and remainers when it comes to Brexit. But the people that leave and are mobile, and that's great. I mean, I don't want to denigrate that, but this it has a darker side, and it casts a shadow over the people that don't go often, who may be just as bright. I mean, this is not. Obviously, there are people of exceptional ability, and people of exceptional ability should probably, on the whole, be from whatever background, should be spotted and encouraged to go to the very highest academic pinnacle, of the Oxford and Cambridges and Imperials and so on. But there are lots of people, most of us are in the middle of the bell curve, and lots of the people who do go through the university funnel are actually more able than the people that don't.
That's the point, isn't it? And what the demarcation you're making between head, hand and heart, what you're actually getting at is you're saying public policy should create the economic arrangements so all three of the groups can thrive.
Yeah.
Otherwise we get this lopsided cognitive class, which ultimately is going to lead us into a cul-de-sac, because guess what? AI and the robots are going to take a lot of those jobs anyway. So we actually need the hands and the heart to create real value.
When I started writing the book, I did think that this was rather an idealistic notion in some ways. I mean, almost a bit new agey, head, hand and heart. Turns out, by the way, to be the motto of Bedale's school, the famous progressive English private school. As I was researching the book, I realised that this is not just an idealistic notion. It's almost a necessity because, as I said earlier, I mean, where AI is coming for the cognitive jobs, and people have still got to do something, and we still have this massive demand, and indeed growing demand as an aging society. We've got the dementia problem. We need 150,000 highly skilled in a often, I mean, partly cognitive, but also sort of caring, emotional intelligence kind of way. We need 150,000 dementia nurses. We've got all of these demands, and indeed many of the jobs that are hardest to automate or to turn into for AI to take over. Many of them are in the hand and heart areas.
David, in that first half, we sort of saw from a bird's eye view what's happened to the UK, what's happened to the labour force, what's happened to the society, and the problems with paying and praising the cognitive class, as you call it, so much, and paying almost no attention or very little attention to those who work with their hands and those who work with their hearts. You can't look at that sort of in a vacuum without saying that the abolition of unions and the abolition of the polytechnic universities had a huge role to play in us championing the head workers over those who work with their hands and those who work with their hearts.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I mean, I describe in the book how I think the kind of the part of the surplus that in the past was scooped up by the power of organised labour has sort of seeped upstairs to the people in the offices, the various sort of professionals in the offices, you know, in doing marketing or design or whatever. Yeah, I mean that there is a very basic sort of economistic version of this story, which is the returns to education have just have increased and increased and increased until quite recently.
What does that mean, the returns?
Well, the higher income associated with the higher qualification you have,
right.
And that has tended to advantage the highly educated and created further incentives for more and more people to get credentialized. I mean, even if you don't use the content of your degree at all, and there've been all sorts of studies have been done that show that the young people do very little work at university, and many of them forget, perhaps particularly in humanities subjects, forget most of what they learn
right.
as soon as they leave. But they're getting this piece of paper because it credentializes them. It means that employers don't have to work so hard in sort of sifting out who are the able people that they want to come and work for them. That's enough. And so that's created this bias to encouraging as many kids as possible, because you then have access to the top 20, 30, 40% of jobs in the society. So why wouldn't you do that if you could?
An unintended consequence of all this is what the late great David Goodhart talked about, your bullshit jobs, because actually not everybody can have that top pay packet and those prestigious roles as they're seen, and it's created a huge admin class who perform jobs which are mundane and morally, socially and spiritually quite damaging. Yeah,
I mean there's the work by Phil Brown and Hugh Lauder on so-called digital Taylorism, I think is very interesting. And the routine, even prior to AI, this is all prior to AI, we still have the routinization of a lot of functions that once did actually require a fair amount of cognitive judgment.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, the classic example of this is the bank manager. The bank manager who used to decide whether to lend the bank's money to local individuals or businesses on the basis of his or her knowledge of the local businesses, and used their judgment based on years of experience.
And also looking at their character and saying, can these people pay this back, and are they honourable?
Yeah.
But now we've got computer says no.
Exactly, you've got an algorithm that now essentially makes those decisions. The algorithm, I mean, might be challenged by a potential borrower, and the bank manager may still be necessary in those circumstances. But it's the routinization of a lot of this work that has and as you say, some economists even argue that one of the reasons for the decline in productivity is the fact that we have created this huge cognitive bureaucracy. And I mean, who is it? The American economist Robert Gordon, who's done a lot of work on productivity, points out that productivity has been declining in many of the richest economies on the planet at the same time as we've never been investing more in elite research universities. Now, I mean, that's not to say we should stop investing in these universities, but they clearly are not a panacea, or they're also creating something else at the same time, which may be this sort of this class of people who are almost piggybacking on the really the useful sort of higher cognitive functions and people that obviously we still require, but there's a sort of the middle and lower levels of people who are sort of piggybacking on their prestige and perhaps even their pay uplift.
So those layers who are piggybacking the elite cognitive functional type, that's where the bullshit jobs and that's occur often, and also that's the drag on productivity, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is the drag on productivity, and it's also potentially politically destabilizing. I mean, this is, revolutions are usually made by disappointed members of the loosely privileged classes. If you think of Robespierre or Lenin, or I mean, I'm not saying we're in a kind of pre-revolutionary moment, but But it creates, it creates a class of people who are very dissatisfied because they've been given expectations of comfortable and well-paid professional employment, and as I said earlier, they're effectively doing the same jobs their non-graduate parents might have done in some relatively lowly administrative function, and that is partly just to do with the changing nature of technology and the way the economy now functions. But we've got to adapt. We've got to get off this treadmill of sending more and more people. We're sending more and more people over the top, as it were, to use a First World War analogy, into these lower paid, lower status cognitive functions that are in any case not really going to be there in 5 or 10 years' time. There's so many vested interests in keeping the higher education system going. I mean, you've got, these universities are all businesses, and they want bums on seats. And they also want, the two ways in which we here in the UK are outliers are, one is as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have an undifferentiated higher education system. We don't, because we abolished the polys, we abolished the higher technical colleges, which most other countries still have. But the other way in which we're an outlier is the very large proportion of kids that go to residential universities. And the universities have a vested interest in that now because they're also property companies. They are selling student accommodation to kids. And these are, this has some upside too. If you think of a lot of our former, great former industrial cities in the Midlands and the North, Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, Liverpool. These towns, these ex-industrial towns have become essentially university towns. Right. Sheffield, I can't remember, I've got the figure in my book. Sheffield, I think in 1975 or 1980 still had sort of 40,000 steel workers and 4,000 students. And it's exactly reversed now. It's got 40 or 50,000 students and 3,000 or 4,000 steel workers.
And the interesting question there is how many landlords? And what is the composite? Are they big corporates that are pulling the rent out of these places? Have students been sent back in this pandemic because landlords need paying and ultimately banks need paying? If you follow the rent money, it tells a very different story.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's all part of the kind of the vested interest that is keeping the system going, even though it is so obviously dysfunctional, both from an economic point of view, as we've discussed, but also from the kind of political and cultural point of view, creating that political dissatisfaction. And we've got to cut the rope. We've got to do something about it. And one thing, obviously, I'm not in favour of closing down half the universities of the country, but we do have rather usefully, we've got this demographic bulge in this country. I don't know, it may be true of some other similar countries too. We've got a little demographic bulge of kind of 18-year-olds coming up, which in theory, if we want to keep the current proportion of school leavers going to university, which it's not quite 50%, actually more like 40 or 45%, we're going to need an extra 300,000 places. So I would advocate just not building those extra, not providing those extra 300,000 places, and so allowing the proportion of 18, 19-year-olds going to university to shrink back down to something more like 30%.
We now face what we here call the silver tsunami, which is the baby boomers retiring, becoming dependent. You mentioned that the uptick in dementia care and old age care, etc., the demand for that is going to increase. 150,000 new nurses. With the pandemic and the word key workers, are we now back into a optimistic phase, really? Because what we're saying is we've now seen how vital these workers are, and the cognitive class aren't, not least how the politicians have dealt with a lot of this. And so therefore, key workers, hand and heart workers, it's going to be a bull market in looking after them.
I think that's true. I wouldn't want to overdo it, but I think all of these things are about nudges in a way, and I think the pandemic has been a very helpful nudge in all sorts of different ways. I think certainly one of them is just the renewed respect, or the new visibility, you might even say, of not just the doctors and nurses were already quite well respected and reasonably well paid.
But the people getting food to shops.
Exactly. It's the kind of people who maintain what I call the kind of hidden wiring of our lives. The people who stack shelves in the supermarket. And also, we have to remember that it tends to be, it's the assumption of highly educated people that work is in itself a form of self-expression, a form of self-actualization, which it is for those of us lucky enough to do the kinds of jobs that you or I do.
But not if you're stuck in a bullshit job.
Well, exactly, but not for about half of the, I mean, surveys show in America and the UK, about half of people still will say, I go to work to earn a living. Right. I do not go to work to self-actualize.
But in the book, you're asking for better conditions, greater pay, because
exactly.
Ultimately that leads to self-esteem.
Yeah. There are certain, there are a certain number of jobs that are always going to be, the actual job itself is never going to be particularly interesting, but it can be, it can be sociable. You have a decent time at work, you're well paid, and you feel respected, because you're, and this does apply to the shelf stacker. The shelf stacker, I remember thinking myself, gosh, I never really noticed these people. When the shelves are empty, you certainly do.
So it's recalibrating a lot of our unexamined assumptions, isn't it?
Yeah.
So give us 3 things that we can do now when we start to think about dignity and status, because that's in the tagline of the book. What can we do? Is the first thing to actually differentiate between the head, the hand and the heart workers and try and begin to give them equal credence?
Yes. I mean, I like I say, I don't think we should be naive about this. I mean, I'm not. I would regard myself as kind of broadly social democratic in political instinct. I'm not an extreme egalitarian. I think we do need meritocratic selection particularly for top jobs, but there are a lot of jobs in the middle and the bottom end of the labour market that are very valuable, that we have undervalued, and I think we're beginning to see that. I think the pandemic has helped in that respect, partly, as I say, through the kind of noticing a lot of how important a lot of those jobs were. And indeed, we are seeing, it's also put the care economy, it's put the kind of heart economy, which obviously includes a lot of cognitive jobs. If you're a medical consultant, you're very much kind of head and heart, probably more head than heart in some ways. But it's because it's placed that at the centre of national attention. They're always important, but they're kind of super important. You've seen recruitment into nursing in the NHS increasing, and I think that is also another good sign, a good thing to have come out of the pandemic in some ways, because we have extraordinary fact. We have 690,000 registered nurses in this country, only 350,000 of whom are actually working. So almost half of the registered nurses are not working as nurses. Right. We've got 300,000 in the NHS and another 50,000 split between the private sector and adult social care. And one of the reasons I think they're not working is because of the extraordinary levels of stress and responsibility that is required. So a lot of these people will be women who have been nurses and left to have a family and then never came back.
More domestic brain drain.
Exactly, it's a kind of domestic brain drain, and I think I mentioned earlier although it's not, the actually starting salaries, or you can 5 years after graduating, you can be on a reasonably decent income as a nurse, but it's more kind of the higher levels are a bit compressed. So if you're going to come back to a job that is incredibly and you've got your own family to think about, you're coming back to a job that's incredibly demanding and stressful, you want to be paid 50 grand for it.
And you want decent working conditions.
And the
politicisation of the NHS through the managerial class haven't provided that.
Yeah, and you want lower productivity, not higher.
So the first thing is awareness and understanding what we've got out there, which we could bring back in. Yeah. What are the other couple of things jumping out of the book that you either changed your mind on or you would take action on today to solve it?
I think the over-academicisation of what happens in secondary schools. I'm very much in favour of the kind of Michael Gove type reforms. I think he has reintroduced some rigour into the system. And it is partly about having proper behaviour in schools. It's partly about teaching rigorously, often in old-fashioned ways. Some of these amazing the kind of avant-garde traditionalists, the Mossborns and Michaelas in London, have absolutely amazing results, and they have, particularly Michaela, has absolutely excellent art and music. You can teach things that are often regarded as sort of soft subjects. You can teach them really rigorously. You can teach them just like you teach biology or French.
I'm so delighted though you said things that are regarded as soft skills, because often when people say to me, soft skills are excellent, but hard skills, you say, well, what are the soft skills? And when they start to describe them, they're exactly the skills you need to run a business, run a family, manage people, whatever it might be. But again, back to your point, that you can't standardize the testing around that, because people operate in very different ways.
Yeah, and or you can to some extent, and we need to put more effort into sort of testing and differentiating in these other areas. It's easy and clear and obvious in the cognitive field, but we need to think about how we do it more in heart and hand areas. So, but back to the schools. I mean, sort of carpentry and sort of metalwork and those kinds of things have almost disappeared from the secondary school curriculum. I think in the US too. I think it's called shop class in the US, and because of the demands of the university sector, which is where the schools are overwhelmingly focused, these things have no value, so they've fallen by the wayside.
So bring those back in.
Well, but yeah, I mean, I think every child should leave school with one non-academic skill. Whether it's whether it's sculpture or coding or playing a musical instrument or something, and perhaps they should do it off-site. They should do it perhaps at local FE college and perhaps with kids from other schools, and there might be an opportunity to mix people up a bit from different classes and ethnic groups and so on. I think something like that would be helpful.
So the first thing is awareness, firstly, of this problem, and stopping sending people, as you put it, over the top into career cul-de-sacs.
Yeah.
Second thing is that children should be leaving school with at least one non-academic skill, preferably not done on campus, and preferably mixing with people who they don't mix with every single day. Third thing, last thing. This is a bit of a sort of softer one, I think, but one of the advantages of the German apprenticeship system, about 50% of school leavers still go into an apprenticeship in Germany. I am an admirer of the German system. I worked in Germany for 3 years as a journalist. I think it's a great place. But I'm also quite sceptical about what we can borrow from it. Obviously, the apprenticeship system there has deep cultural, historical, and institutional roots, so we can't just adopt it here. We have to build our own version. But one of the good things about the German apprenticeship system is that all classes do it. So somebody like me, my kids could easily be doing an apprenticeship in Germany. I might have one kid who's at university, one kid who's doing an apprenticeship. You do it partly you do it, whereas here, middle-class kids go to university if they can't think what to do. In Germany, they would often do an apprenticeship if they can't think what to do. And you then you've got a kind of meal ticket to life. You have a skill under your belt. And a lot of middle-class, even upper-middle-class young Germans do apprenticeships. And the equivalent here might be that it becomes more respectable. When people from high status backgrounds start not going to university but becoming artisanal bakers, that may seem a kind of slightly silly and trivial example, but I think that would actually when multiplied thousands and thousands of times, that starts to send signals, and people just start to sort of see things differently. And so we've got all of these sort of different functions of education, which are all valuable. As I said earlier, we're concentrating far too much of it on school leavers. We need to spread it out. We need to maintain all those different functions. We need to get the economic education relationship back into kilter, because that's got badly out of kilter. I'm meant to be coming with my third. No, you have done.
Have I?
Yeah, I'm just going to sum them up.
Oh, okay.
So the first thing is awareness of head, hand, heart. The second thing is that children leaving school with one non-academic facet, vocational skill, if you like. And then lastly is the return of German-style apprenticeships. Is that about right?
Well, I think it's a status question relating to craft, manual, and caring functions. It's
so creating people who are active in the real economy.
Yeah.
Many people would vote for that.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the book. And for also taking on such a huge topic. you dedicated it to your children and also said, hopefully this is the only thing of mine that they'll read. They'd do quite well to read this, wouldn't they? Because how old are they?
Well, they're all in their 20s. So,
right. But what's coming down the track for them is exactly what you're talking about, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I said that partly because I have written a couple of books that they haven't actually read. My father was actually, at least some of his life was a writer. He wrote various books, which I never read when he was alive. I had to read them all to say something at his funeral. So I was just hoping that they might be able to read that. And I thought this book, because it's a kind of more graspable sort of theme. The very title is Head, Hand, Heart. It's something that they will be affected by in their own lives. They're already affected by in their own lives.
David Goodhart, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.